Allow me to introduce you to the most electrifying
podcast.
Oh my God.
All right, so let's get this
beans.
thing rolling then, right? Okay, so it's
Let's do it.
What have we changed our name to?
We are now Wrestling with Narrative. That is WWN.
WWN people.
It's extremely wrestling relevant. So that is our name. And today we're going to be talking about the American hero. And we're sort of going to observe that through the decades because the American hero changes. It doesn't stay the same, right? And we're going to sort of observe it in 4 different decades. We're going to observe the 80s, we're going to observe the 90s, the 2000s, and the 2010s.
Indeed.
So,
probably today, I think we're just going to focus on maybe the 80s and 90s,
yeah.
like 70s, mostly 80s, and then a little bit of the 90s. But I think we should probably maybe stretch this out over 2 podcasts because there's so much.
This is going to be definitely like a deep cut. So we're definitely going to have to divide this into parts. There's so much information just on the 80s alone, right? Like there's so much stuff just to cover on the 80s. We might not even get a chance to mention the 90s, but that's fine. We could do a whole video on the 90s later, But if we just look at the 80s alone as a decade, you can't help but look at one particular character that represents, Americana, right? There's only one guy, and that's going to be Hulk Hogan. So if we're talking about American heroes within the wrestling context, we have to look at him a little bit.
Oh, undoubtedly. And we're going to look at Hulk Hogan, 1980s, this kind of very big boom of professional wrestling, a way that hadn't occurred before. And I think maybe you did more of the research for this side of things, just in terms of what was happening, what was relevant at the time in the United States, a little bit economically, a little bit socially. So how about we start off with you going through the things that you researched and your analysis, and then I'll jump in with my interpretation of the Hogan character, and we can go from there. You want to do that?
Yeah, we could do that. It's important to begin with the start of the decade, right? So the 1970s was like so much a decade of conflict. You saw the end of the Vietnam War. The morale in the United States was pretty low. It was the morale wasn't very great, and there was also a big problem with inflation in the country. So
why exactly was morale low, do you think?
I think morale was really low just because we had, if you look at the 60s and 70s, you look at, like I said, with the Vietnam War, it was something that was so many people were not in favor of this war that occurred for such a really long time.
Yeah.
If you look at some of the college riots that occurred, especially the ones where there was like military intervention, that created a huge amount of dissension in the country. Okay. People were not happy with that. Not only that, but you're also getting all of these American soldiers that are coming back to the United States, and they're not really getting any type of financial support from the government, right? You're not only that, but you're getting soldiers that are also coming back with all sorts of types of PTSD, and that I think aided massively in this unhappiness and unrest that is occurring. Mind you, we can't also forget that if we're talking about the 1970s, we have to talk about Nixon a little bit, and the whole Watergate scandal, that has to be mentioned. All of these things sort of played a role, and they sort of snowballed into a lot of the unhappiness that was occurring in the country at the time.
So you're going to say that at the late 70s, early 80s, people had kind of lost faith in America, maybe? Is that safe?
Yeah, you would say that, like, If you could think about it as like you could see like the paint chipping away a little bit, right? Like you could see the happiness, a lot of this strong American pride started to waver a bit. People started to really question the motives of their own government after seeing some of the things with Nixon, with the Vietnam War. Yeah, it started to change.
So then what happened after that?
Right. So one of the big things is that as people start to really rebel against really government intervention and sort of feeling like the government is something that is very untrustworthy because of aforementioned, like I said, like the Vietnam War and all these other types of things, Nixon, an entire new market starts to come to life on individualism. So individualism becomes like this big thing, right? So it starts
it's more like, I can't rely on the government anymore, so I have to rely on myself, something like that.
Yeah. Yeah, people start to really appreciate individualism and freedom. They want to break away from like a government that feels oppressive and so on and so forth.
So but is it also then safe to say at this point, so we're looking at a majority of people who want smaller government, right? Maybe?
Yeah, I mean, perhaps. People that or they want less government intervention, you know? And they at least don't want to be governed so much.
Those are traditionally right-leaning values, right?
Yeah, exactly. What's interesting here is that it doesn't take long for marketing to become aware of this need, right? They start to become aware that people are starting to become a little more introspective about themselves, and that people are looking for ways to seek their own individual freedom through different things like activities and projects and different things like that. So as that becomes popular, different products started being marketed with this in mind.
Okay.
So
do you have any examples of this?
I don't have any examples of exact products. I don't have any examples of products, but I know that the idea is basically that a product could buy you your freedom, right?
So a push towards consumerism, like if you're unhappy, buy product XYZ and you're going to feel great. Something like that?
Yeah, pretty much, right? Okay. So this whole, because one of the things is that people are also becoming very aware at the time that people, that there's companies out there that are just basically selling you something. They want to sell you something so they can make a profit. And this seems a little, it doesn't really seem like something that people are on board with, or it seems like it's sort of very advantageous. So what companies start to do instead is they just focus on giving people that sensation that a product is not really meant to own them, but that the product can be a tool through which somebody could be free, right? So it's really just kind of profiting off of this desire that people have.
Okay, so how does this tie into our icon, our hero through the 80s?
So how does that lead to the 80s?
Yeah.
So what's very interesting to note is that in 1981, Ronald Reagan decides to run for the presidency, and his entire campaign is basically run this way. He starts delivering like all these different speeches during his presidential campaign where...
So was this 81 or 80?
81. No, well, the campaigns are occurring in 1980. He's elected in 1981. That is when he becomes the president of the United States.
Okay.
So his entire team basically does this. He starts saying that he doesn't want the people to have to fight their own government, that the government often stands in the way of the people, and that he I think the quote was like that he wants to let people run wild. He wants people to be free. He says something along the lines of letting people be free to do what he knows they can do.
Okay.
So his entire campaign is basically planned this way. It's just government intervention isn't good. we have to fight the government because the government is getting in the way of people's liberties. The whole thing here is freedom. And as a matter of fact, one thing that was kind of interesting is that of all the presidential campaigns that there have been throughout the years, I think the biggest word that Reagan used was freedom. That word is repeated over and over and over again in all of his debates and all of his speeches. So that's his whole deal.
I wonder if someone's ever counted up the number of times he said it. Probably, right?
I'm sure there's got to be somebody out there who's counted this, But
okay.
it's kind of interesting, right? It's kind of interesting how he is coming in as a Republican, and he's using this type of dialogue that at the time felt kind of, it wasn't to be really expected from the Republican Party, but he ends up winning by a landslide. He wins the presidential elections.
Who was he running
pretty convincingly? Let me look this up. Let's look up who he was running up against. He was running up against. Give me a sec while I check this. But
he was against Jimmy Carter, I guess, it seems here.
Yeah, was it Jimmy?
Yep. Who, let's see, it said, supposedly one of his platforms was he was running against Jimmy Carter, and Carter was seen as like kind of a weak incumbent.
That's right.
Because he sort of went back and forth and whatever. Classic flip-flop, I guess. I don't know. I don't know enough about this to say for sure, but okay. So Reagan becomes president. In 1980, he becomes president. All right. So then what happens? Why do you care about this?
Yeah, so he becomes president, and a lot of the values that he starts to promote are like this whole idea of freedom and liberty, but he is also like really, really, what he's doing is he's paving the way for his economic plans. So he's paving the way for like these plans he's paving the way to be able to promote more of a free market society, which a lot of people started calling Reaganomics. And this whole concept of less government regulation, this whole concept of trickle-down economics, where if you just allow the rich to spend and if you allow the rich to do what they do, eventually the poor are going to reap the rewards of that because jobs will open up and everyone is going to prosper. So that causes all sorts of things that I don't want to get too much into here because I do want to get into the Hogan stuff. But that sort of opens the doors to huge amounts of consumerism, Not only that, but it also has to be mentioned that this is like, we're also like the 80s is all about the Cold War, right? We're in the Cold War. Reagan was one of the biggest spenders in defense, I believe I think he spent more on defense than the last 4 presidents combined before him. So yeah, the numbers are pretty insane. Like he spent a ton of money on defense. So a lot of the stuff that's not only occurring now is you have the Cold War. So you very much have an us versus them thing happening. You also have the Iran-Contra deal, which is occurring at the same time as all of this. So
what is the Iran-Contra deal?
So basically, the Contras were a revolutionary force, or they were a right-wing force that were alive in Nicaragua. Okay. And what happened is that the Nicaraguan government, which was like actually really, really oppressive, they got overtaken by the Sandinistas, who were a communist group. So the communists eventually, they staged a coup, they took over the country, and the United States didn't want that to happen because they didn't want any communism occurring, underneath them or below them in Central America. The Americans, since they were also cutting deals in Iran, and they were trying to. They also had been involved over there. They decided that they were going to take some of the arms, some of the weapons they had from Iran.
Yes.
And they were going to start giving those to the right-wing soldiers in Nicaragua to overthrow the Sandinista government.
Okay.
Nobody knew this was going on at the time, but there was all this involvement happening, and when that came out, it was a huge scandal. The fact that the United States was basically funding a military uprising in Nicaragua by getting rid of the Sandinistas.
Would you say that this had a negative impact on the way that U.S. peoples saw Iran?
I think more so it started to crack a little bit. It started to show a little bit more of the U.S.'s foreign policy and how dirty it kind of was. I think people were still very much aware of it to some degree, but I think if anything, when that information divulged, that the government had its hands in all these different things, if anything, it started to give people this impression that, things are still, things still weren't very good in the United States, or the foreign policy was.
The reason
was still,
I ask is because, as we know, Iron Sheik was billed from Iran, right? And Iron Sheik was heel. So I wonder if maybe that was one of the reasons potentially that they decided to go with Sheik as the heel champion.
That's very no, absolutely.
And,
I mean,
of course, in 1984, right? That's when Hogan was first won the championship, and he won it off of Iron Sheik.
Yeah. I mean, that could definitely, I could definitely see that, just the way that the Iron Sheik was, one of the main heels at the time, and there was definitely a lot of tension between Iran and the United States at that time as well.
Okay.
So that's definitely the case. But nonetheless, there is definitely, as you can see in the 80s, there's like this big, U.S. versus the Soviets, U.S. versus Iran, U.S. versus the communists. There's a lot of this happening, right? And I think that obviously is going to play a big role in I guess the American pride that someone like Hulk Hogan is going to have, right? So going into Hogan, right? How does that tie into Hogan? And that's sort of the thing that we have to get on, right? That's the subject here. Hogan is kind of interesting because he represents in many ways a lot of what I see as sort of like the crystallization of 80s America.
Okay.
He's so very much this character that he's beach blonde, he's like this huge guy, right?
Yes.
And there's so many things about, I mean, if you look at some of the promotion of Hogan during his reign, he's holding an electric guitar. He's, in Venice Beach.
Waves the flag around a lot, I remember.
He waves the flag around a lot. So
his freaking theme song was "I Am a Real American." Okay, let me see if I can.
He's a real.
I am a real American. Fight for the rights of
every man.
I am a real American. Fight for the rights. Fight for what's right. And
that's right.
Bunch of unintelligible stuff, like when it comes crashing down and it hurts inside. Like, what does that mean? I don't know. I got to take a stand. It don't help to hide. I think it's something like that. I've got.
I have to. Yeah. And there's a part two. And there's a part two where he's.
Courage is a thing that makes us free. Is that how it goes? But okay,
I think so. I remember there's a part two where it's like he says, "I have to be a man. I can't let it slide."
Right. Yeah. So there's a
like
lot
a
of
whole.
This very macho, very stand up for what's right, do the right thing, the American way, truth, justice,
definitely,
and the American way,
mm-hmm.
as embodied by
by Hulk Hogan
in the 80s.
That's right.
Electric guitar, and he's just going wild.
He's going wild, and I think it's very interesting seeing because it's so open, right? It's so America, right? It's so America. Like there's something.
Okay, so here's a question I have. We say that that's so American, right? This idea of rock and roll, and you got to be strong and manly and stand up and fight the bad guys. And here's an eagle, and I'm driving a giant truck and stuff, right? Like, how much of that was fabricated during this time period in the 1980s? Like,
I think a good part of it.
I didn't do any research into the time before this, but what made an American in 1950, or what made an American in 1930, right?
That's right.
Like,
yeah.
Wasn't being this enormous roided blonde man who
yeah
on them.
Yeah, like this giant dude with an electric guitar. Absolutely. No, but I think perhaps some of the values that he represented, some of that had already been laid down by the era itself, by, again, some of the things that Reagan had spoken about in his presidency, and even some of the capitalism that was so alive at the time.
Okay.
Because a big part of it.
Would you say that Hulk Hogan is like this inflated capitalist representation of American success, maybe something like that?
I would say so. Yeah, there's definitely success, right? I mean, look, he's a gigantic man. He's like 6'8", 6'6", 300 pounds. And they show him as a successful person who, like, first of all, he's winning the majority of his matches fairly easily. This is like in the old days when a match was like 5 minutes long. Like the dude was having like the shortest matches ever because he couldn't really work a lot. It was just basically power moves, leg drop, 1, 2, 3, you're done.
Right, lots of arms kind of moving around, maybe a lariat too, and then
right.
Whatever it was, like either
so he's like super
body slam, leg drop, right?
He's like super successful, ultra successful. But I think the driving force behind this is that he is promoting the right values, the values that are hard work. I fight for what I believe in. Jeez,
right. So we had what was it? What was his motto? His motto was
eat your vitamins, say your prayers,
and like train or something like that, right?
Yeah, that's right. So it's like you can't, at the time, he, as successful as he was and as dominant as he was, you would still pop for him and you would still cheer for him.
Well, he was also new, right? We hadn't really seen. Superstar Billy Graham was the original Hulk Hogan.
That's right. Yeah.
We'll say, right, and Hulk Hogan supposedly stole all the stuff from Billy Graham, like the whole, like, I got 24-inch pythons, brother, and the boas and the crazy tie-dye ring attire, just this kind of over-the-top, extremely good physique, right? Like Billy Graham was one of those guys who was like a decade before his time in what a wrestler was supposed to look like, right? Because at the time, I mean, Bruno Sammartino was a tank of a man, like,
sure,
physique, but he wasn't cut. He was just
he wasn't a bodybuilder.
Right?
He wasn't ripped.
Yeah,
he didn't have a bodybuilder physique.
And that was kind of what Hogan was all about, right? Like Hogan was also a little bit pudgy, but he was supposed to be a bodybuilder, right? Just an enormous bodybuilder from Venice Beach who he's a rock and roll cool dude who does the right thing. Except that he was supposedly a heel when he first came into the company, but we don't have to talk about that.
Never. He's an American hero.
That's right.
But an American hero, that's it. No, absolutely. I mean, if you look at him, he doesn't look like your average 70s wrestler. If you just go down the list of like Dusty Rhodes, if you look at like Ric Flair, right? Like, they were big guys. They were burly dudes, but they weren't ripped.
Yeah, Hogan came into WWE in 1979, right?
At the end of the decade, yeah.
So
that's when he arrived in WWE.
He was in WWE 1979. Reagan gets elected to as president in 1981. Then, if we're
That's right,
the logic that we set up, right? At this point, maybe there is that kind of push towards a more how did you put it? It was a more like individualism, individual consumerism kind of type of deal.
I think so. I think there's an individualism to it, right? And it's individualism, but it has the word freedom in it. My freedom.
The freedom to do what you want type of deal. So before the podcast came on, we were kind of talking a little bit about Ayn Rand's idea of objectivism, right? And like, I don't know enough about this to go into any depth here. And I mean, she wrote Fountainhead and Atlas Shrugged. That was in, I think it was the 60s, wasn't it?
Perhaps. I think it was like the 60s.
Yeah, I'm not exactly sure.
I think it was the 60s. Yeah. I think that's when she had wrote those. Yeah.
Should have done a little bit more research here. But let's see. Yeah, it looks like it was 1950 even, actually. 57. Yeah. So, okay, that's kind of maybe a little bit before the time of what we're talking about, but it does seem to kind of tie in to this idea that America is moving more towards the idea of the individual. In order to be successful, you got to focus on being this great big consumer who's out for you, and the American dream changed, perhaps. This is wild speculation, right? From having a nice, stable job, a house, 2.5 kids, maybe a dog, something like that in suburbia, to this more wheeling dealing 1980s, let's get the Wolf of Wall Street
that's right
lifestyle here, right? And Hogan kind of feels like that, right? He's so over the top, he's so much larger than life. He's he's a superstar, right?
Yes, and also I think it's sort of like you're sort of teetering between both. Just like if you look at Hogan and if you look at the politics of the time, there's still this sort of like moral compass going on where as an American I have to do what's right.
Yeah,
you know, and I'm going to you're villainizing you're very much villainizing other groups of people, in this case the Soviet Union, or it could be Iran, or it could be whatever deal the United States was in at the time, because I, as an American, these are my values and this is what I believe in, and I have to fight for my right to believe in what I have, and I have to stand for my beliefs. And Hogan has that, but at the same time, there's this other capitalistic part that is so clearly there. The money is out of control. Hogan, I mean, if you look at Hogan as a character, he is very much like an enormously muscular Ken doll. You know, he's like super blonde, super jacked, oiled up, like all the time.
They never marketed him as rich, though, right? Like they never.
No, he's never marketed as a rich guy.
Yeah,
because he's not the rich guy. He's supposed to be like, you know, like I'm just good at a little elbow grease and hard work, you know. Like there's a lot of that going on. But if you look at his
right, because we had talked before about whether or not Hogan is an underdog, right?
That's right. Hogan, yeah, but
he kind of felt like a lot of the things that he was saying. He kind of felt like he was supposed to be an underdog, but like he's gigantic. He's strong,
right?
And
he's not.
Always wins, right?
He always wins.
Can't possibly be an underdog. And
no,
I just thought of right now who was another very iconic figure. There's a couple of them in the '80s, right? The '80s action hero, and one of them is Sylvester Stallone and Rocky, right? And, right, and it was Rocky 2, I think, that Hogan appeared in, and that's why he got out of WWE for a little while, right? Like it was a WWF at the time, or was it WWF at the time? He got kicked out because he wasn't supposed to be in that film. He didn't get like clearance from Vince Sr. at the time or something along those lines.
Yeah.
But we even see that transformation because Rocky 1 came out in, I think it was the 70s, right? It was before the 80s, certainly. It was 1976, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then Rocky 2 was 1979, okay? So then in Rocky 1, what do we have? We've got this guy, he's kind of down and out, but he's got a good heart and he's got a great work ethic. And he does the audacity of challenging Apollo Creed, heavyweight champion.
Yeah.
And he loses, right? And that was the great charm of Rocky. It wasn't that he was a champion, it was that he just did his best and he tried really hard and he accomplished something that no one thought he could do. Then 1979 rolls around, Rocky 2, Rocky's Revenge. And excuse me, I think it was Rocky 3 that Hogan appeared in. That would make more sense, right? Yeah, it was Rocky 3 because that was when Mr. T was in it. Rocky 2 is he overcomes the champion and he accomplishes his dream, but it still has that very much underdog feeling, right? Rocky 3, 82. This is where Hogan appears. And this is when Rocky goes from kind of being the underdog to being the guy who's on top. And it's a challenge to beat Mr. T because he's getting soft as the champion. But then he comes back and he wins. And then Rocky 4 is when it's totally out of control. 1985, the 80s are in full swing. And
Ivan Drago.
Yeah, Rocky has to fight the Russian
guy
or whatever,
Yeah.
So we didn't talk about this at all before, but looking at Hogan and Rocky at the same time is also kind of an interesting parallel to the way that Hogan's character sort of evolved as well.
Yeah.
Like, so what do we have here now? We've got Hogan wins the belt for the first time in 1984, as we said. He wins it off of Iron Sheik. Iron Sheik had only been champion for like 30 days or something. I think what happened was Bob Backlund.
I don't remember how long his reign was.
Yeah, Bob Backlund. Did he? Yeah, he beat him by submission. And then he held the belt for about a month. So he was kind of like this interim champion, someone that Hulk Hogan, because they wanted to pass the belt over to a new generation guy, right? Because Bob Backlund had already been champ two or three times, and he was like a long running champ for like 2 years, 2 years, 2 years or something like that. He's getting kind of old, boring. It's time, for this 1984 crazy over the top guy to come around, beat this foreign threat, Iron Sheik, the Iranian. And then Hulk Hogan becomes champion, and his reign lasts for 1,474 days. So that's like 4 years. Like it's almost exactly 4 years, a little bit more, I think.
So that is beginning. So that's 4 years. That reign lasts from, you said 84, 85.
He started in 84. Yeah, it was January
84,
1984,
and goes till 1988.
Yes,
that's pretty insane. I mean, it's mostly it's insane too because in modern WWE world, the concept of that is crazy. And as we said, like you said, I think the second longest reign was Punk, right? CM Punk is it's either the third longest or it's definitely close.
So after that crazy long 4-year reign by Hogan into 88, like there had been a bunch of guys who had held the belt for lengthy periods of time, right? So of course Bob Backlund, he held it for like 2 or 3 periods of 2 or 3 years. Bruno Sammartino was like untouchable. He had the belt for, I think the first time it was close to 10 years. It was like 8 years. 2,803 days. And then he held it again for 1,237 days. So almost 4 years again. there. So like 8 years, 4 years, and then Hogan held it for the 4 years, and after that, yeah, the person who held it the longest was CM Punk, and that was for like 480 days.
Yeah, I remember. Yeah, it was a year and it was a year plus. You know, and that's like the longest thing.
That was in 2011, I believe.
Yeah. So one thing that's very interesting here, mentioning Hogan's title reign, is that it's really dominant. That is clear. You know, he's champion for a really, really, really long time.
Yep.
And now there's something that you mentioned before. There's something we were talking before we started the podcast was about Superman, right?
Yeah.
Sort of like the Superman archetype, like this type of hero. And it's very interesting to me because if you look at the dominance of Hulk Hogan, it's not too different from the dominance of Superman himself, right? Now, not that I read the comics, but I know enough about it where Superman is like this invincible alien, right? He's essentially an alien. He's an alien creature who came to Earth. He was adopted by an American family, and he's basically impossible to defeat. He's just unbelievably powerful.
Right.
You know?
So I think that this Superman archetype, and when we say archetype, we're not talking about archetypes in the traditional sense, like Jungian archetypes or even like the Nietzschean Ubermensch, but probably that's where Superman found.
There's a little bit of that too.
Right? So I did a little bit of looking into Superman and the comic book version of Superman, right? And like how he was developed and from what time. So first time that he appeared in the comics was June 1938, Action Comics. Superman fans know this already, right? So what was happening in America?
Definitely.
It was the Depression. The U.S. was in its isolation period, right? New Deal had been kind of put into effect by FDR, and this was 3 years before we entered World War II.
That's right.
Where Pearl Harbor happened in 1941, right? So what does Superman represent as a hero? Why do we care about him? Why is he interesting for us? So he's this unbeatable strongman hero, right? Who we can put our faith into because times are hard, right? We don't know if we're going to be able to get over this really difficult economic period. And we want to believe that there is this kind of hope out there, that there's someone that maybe is going to save us from the insane Nazi war machine that's steamrolling Europe.
Right.
And then after that, of course, as you had mentioned too, up until the 80s, there was the Cold War threat of Soviet Russia. And Superman kind of felt relevant throughout this period because whether we want to admit it or not, right, the U.S. was not necessarily as accepted as a global superpower that it is.
That's right. And I think that's a very important detail too, right? Because right now in 2019, we can't help but see the United States as being like the most powerful nation in the world, right? Like this unbelievable superpower, and we have for a couple decades now. But we also have to be aware of the fact that up until, in that time period, we were not like the dominators of the world.
Right. So I dug
up we were still behind the many European superpowers.
Exactly. The one fact I dug up that was so hilariously interesting to me was before we got into World War II, the U.S. was ranked in terms of military strength 19th in the world after Portugal. So all of the real strong military powers existed were in Europe, right? And why? Because the Europeans were fighting each other for hundreds of years. So of course they needed to have powerful militaries. But particularly, as I said at the time, this was isolationist America. We had finished, for the most part, conquering the entire landmass, sea to shining sea. And we didn't have to fight. We defeated the Mexicans. We defeated the Native Americans.
The British.
We beat the British. The Canadians beat us. No one ever talked about that. But, it only happened for one day. Something like that. Yeah, I know. And so, right, getting back to this idea of what Superman is and why it was a character that people hung on to, because there was still not this idea that America is number one, right?
Right.
But we did have the work ethic, perhaps. I think we can say that, right? No.
That's a big part of it, yeah.
Superman's whole thing, right? We said at the very beginning, truth,
Yeah,
justice, the American way.
and what's
Whatever
yeah,
that.
and to just add to that a little bit, like remember, even though Superman is like sort of like this unstoppable force, right? Completely infallible, like can't be destroyed, can't be beaten by any human, even though he has all these things, he well, the things that are super American about him is he loves his family, he stands by his people, he fights for his principles, so like he always fights for his beliefs. And and another thing that's important is that he's from middle America, right? That's kind of a big detail there. I think he's from Kansas, right? Or he's from somewhere in the Midwest. And he's constantly, he's like helping his family out on a farm. So there's still very much this whole working man,
Pretty wholesome. Pretty wholesome.
wholesome working man thing going on with Superman.
So how
right?
does Superman go from that to Hulk Hogan, right?
That's what's interesting, right? So if you look at the Hogan character, he's very interesting because much like Superman, he in wrestling kayfabe world, not really beaten very often. He is this giant guy who beats everybody.
He's basically undefeatable. Basically,
he's undefeatable.
4 years he was on top. He was the de facto champion, and
right.
He's this super good guy. Does the right thing.
And but
people
much like
him, right? Like he was
much like
super popular.
Very popular, and that's the thing. Even though he is being booked like a Superman, he has all his morals are where they should be. He's a hardworking guy. His principles are in the right place. They sort of have a lot of the wholesome American values that Superman represented, And up until that time, in those 4 years, people were crazy about it. Even though it had been going on for so long, he managed to, he had a 4-year run. It was 1,500 days. That's what it was.
Something along those lines. Yeah.
That is insane when we think about it from a modern context, that a guy could be over for that long,
Right. So
it's,
so then what happens, right? 1988 rolls around, and who is the guy that dethrones Hogan?
That is.
Do you remember?
That's
It's Andre the Giant. Believe it or not, it was Andre the Giant who beat Hogan.
Was it
the only person
after WrestleMania 3?
It was no, it was like a house show or something. It's a main event. So what happened apparently was
forgot about that one.
This was when Andre did a heel turn. Because up until that point, Andre was the lovable, gentle, not necessarily gentle, right? But he was the giant that everyone loved. And then he did the heel turn, and it was this undefeatable titan. The only one who could beat Hulk Hogan was Andre, right? And he had kind of been, I think he was corrupted by like Ted DiBiase or something along those lines.
I see.
Yeah, it was like a wonky count by the referee, something like that. Yes, that's what happened. So Ted DiBiase, he paid the ref to count fast. Andre the Giant beat Hogan, although apparently like Hogan kicked out at 1, because of course he did. But then immediately Andre turns around, gives the belt to Ted DiBiase, who is corrupt, crooked, and
right.
Then the belt is vacated. So I don't know why this ended up happening. I mean, it was vacated because Jack Turner, the supposed WWF president, he said like that's not on the up and up. We're vacating the belt. Then Randy Savage wins. He holds the belt for about a year. And Hogan gets it back in 89, right?
That's right.
So the 80s are kind of like winding down at this point. I think Hogan was probably still wildly popular, even after Randy Savage, right?
Yeah. Yeah, no, he was definitely still very popular, right? He was still a big star, but you would say that as we're approaching the 90s, that sort of hyper dominant American man character that Hogan is, it's starting to wear a little thin, you know.
Right. So
it's starting to taper off.
Why this happened, and it comes back to the Superman analysis, right? And what had happened after 1989, right? Berlin Wall comes down. So now we have the American people have successfully, or the West has defeated the Red Menace. Soviet Union has collapsed. And who is coming out on top? The United States is now super dominant. We don't have to worry about the Cold War anymore. And we're rolling into the 90s. And what's happened? Now we don't really need a Superman to hold our hand and tell us everything is going to be all right, because we know everything is going to be all right. The 80s, we had great economic growth, as you had mentioned, been set up, and people are getting fatigue, Superman fatigue.
Yeah.
More specifically, in this case, Hogan fatigue, right?
Yeah, because much like Hogan, the United States at this point, it's like, well, okay, we're number one. This is like, we defeated the Soviets. The Red Menace is over. I mean, once you get to the top, it's kind of, that's when things get a little tricky, right?
Yeah.
The story gets a little complicated.
When you're at the top, who could possibly threaten you?
Right.
So for Hogan, it took Andre the Giant, right? This guy who was literally undefeated, I think, ever. He was never defeated. I'm pretty sure Andre.
Well, up until
to one
Hogan
ever
to Hogan.
Yeah, basically.
When Hogan slammed him at WrestleMania 3 and all that.
And and then that was a huge turnaround too. Then that proved symbolically Hogan was a giant killer. He was even stronger than the strongest guy who had been dominant for 10 years or however long Andre had been wrestling and beating the crap out of people. Right. So
yeah.
I have a couple of notes here about former champions too, but I don't know if we really need to go over that. We kind of talked about that. I think now we can either, well, we're kind of coming up on 50 minutes here. We can either leave the 90s for next time or talk about it a little bit. I think just to cap off the 80s here. So we had Randy Savage, right? So Randy Savage is a lot like Hulk Hogan, but he's a little bit more over the top even, right? Like he cut the crazy promos. He had the insane glasses and the cowboy hat, the tassels.
Yeah, but over the top nonetheless, just super over the top.
Right. And then even more insane and like literally
my favorite,
a freaking crazy humanoid that comes from
Ultimate. You gotta love him,
right? Who is
Ultimate Warrior?
Yeah, Ultimate Warrior is basically Hulk Hogan, and we use this phrase jokingly. He's Hulk Hogan on steroids, right?
Yeah, he's steroids on steroids. It's so ridiculous.
And Warrior was kind of the beginning of the 90s in terms of the wrestling persona, I think.
Well, because the thing for me, okay, this is my idea of Warrior, is that he still, like, he was basically, if you could distill Hulk Hogan even more, like if you basically took Hogan and you distilled him even more so that he was just like pure essence of an 80s muscle man that just screams, that's what he would be. So he is a giant roided monster who like grunts and goes like like he does that weird grunt thing. It makes no sense. He comes from a planet that nobody knows. And he sort of encapsulates a lot of that energy, right?
So
like
maybe
this
he's the
absurd
dying vestiges of 1980s professional wrestling.
I really think he is in a lot of ways, you know? Like he really is like the dying, like the remnants of an entire decade. And if anything, it's more of this sort of something that Savage had it to some degree, Hogan had it, Warrior definitely had it. It was this energy of an unstoppable force, right? We are this ball of energy, and I will not stop no matter how much you want me to stop. You know, so I think it's a representation of willpower and a representation of overcoming something that's trying to hold you down.
Sure. He was only champion once.
Yeah.
Which so that was 90, right? He beat Hogan, and then he lost it to who did he lose it to? He lost it to Sergeant Slaughter. I don't know.
Yeah, I believe it was. I think it was Slaughter.
Then Hogan gets it back. Then Undertaker takes it. Then Hogan gets it back. Then it was vacated. Then Ric Flair had it. Randy Savage. So we're seeing a lot of changes happening here. Like the belt is changing hands a lot faster. Early 90s. A lot of
keep in mind
or less than 1 year. They're all less than 1 year.
Yeah, keep in mind as we're transitioning into the new decade and we're seeing all these title changes, one thing to note is that the steroid scandal is occurring in the WWE at the same time. This was occurring at the end of the decade, beginning of the 90s. That's when all of this happened. This is a big part of it too. You're having it's kind of interesting how you can look at it this way, right? You have the end of the 80s. You could say like a lot of disillusionment within the country as we're transitioning into the presidency of George Senior, right? You have the war, you have the Persian Gulf War occurring, and as that's happening, you're also seeing like the layers of kayfabe peeling down with the steroid scandal, because for the longest time this was wrestling was still pretty kayfabe protected. Now you've got the steroid scandal occurring, the veneer is coming down. People are going, okay, wait a minute. Why is Vince McMahon what is he on trial for? Like, why is he speaking to judges? Why is
he an announcer on trial?
Yeah, like he's an announcer guy who owns, people know he was like, he was the owner of the company, but it's like, what's going on? And Hulk Hogan had to testify for those things too. He showed up for trial as well, and that actually was one of the big reasons why Hogan left. That was one of the big reasons why Hogan left the WWF. So this all sort of came like there's this definite paradigm shift occurring at the end of this decade and moving into the 90s.
Right. And I think that's a good place to maybe put a pin in that, because there's a lot of interesting things we could pick up there, and maybe dive deeper into, like the steroid scandal. What does that mean in terms of the image that these supermen-like characters had been portrayed with before, right? So now, you used a good word. I think you said like the disillusionment, right? We thought that these superhuman people were that way just because that's what they were. But you know what? Actually, guess what? Maybe they weren't. And then what happened from that point on, when the folk hero of America has now let us down? There's not a huge threat anymore. What are we going to turn to? And what wrestling characters then start to present themselves to us in the 90s? And there's a long list of really interesting characters that we can from
there's
here.
A lot to talk about there.
So maybe we can pick that up and start talking about the 90s in the next one.
Yeah, that's right. That's definitely somewhere to take it, because things obviously changed a lot in the new decade. The 90s sort of brought a whole change within the wrestling sphere. Now let's do how about a quick little summary? You think? Like, what are some parting words?
Sure. Okay. Yeah. Just to reiterate everything that we went over.
Give me some of your parting words, and I'll do mine.
So the thing that I took away from our conversation, everything that we built up here, was the character of Hulk Hogan found his success in the embodiment of a Superman character that was still relevant in the United States at the time, and by the end of his reign, his waning popularity came to the fact that we had Superman fatigue. We had defeated all of these implied threats, and we wanted something a little bit different, a little bit more fresh. We didn't need that Superman character to be here and hold our hands through these uncertain times, because times were pretty good. So that's kind of what I took away from it as a whole. What about you?
I got the same thing. There's one word that keeps coming to my mind, which is there's a little bit of promise here, right? There's an illusion of promise going on in the 80s. This idea that, like, look, we as an American people, we can still have our freedom. We could still